Welcome, everybody, to the OPT Network. This morning, we're talking about vaccinations. We know that there are still many people, for whatever the reason, that are hesitant about being vaccinated. And sadly, vaccinations have become politicized. And when you talk to people on either side, many people say, I don't think there's enough research that's been done. I need to do more research. And I need more information before I take the leap and get vaccinated. Well, we decided to turn to an expert, an immunologist. She's got her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School at Boston's Children's Hospital. She has been an immunologist for well over a decade, and she's really traveling the country talking about immunology and immunizations and helping us to get a better understanding. Our guest this morning is Dr. Azza Gadir, and we welcome her all the way from New York City for the very first time. Azza, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you've got so many credentials and so much information, but beyond that, I want to talk about how you got involved and how you came to make this your life's work, immunology.
Yep. So I studied biochemistry and immunology in college. And kind of fell in love with immunology during that process. Immunology being studying the immune system and trying to understand how it protects us from disease, but also how it can cause certain diseases. My main area of training is autoimmunity. So I got my PhD in lupus and then went on to work on food allergies and understanding why the immune system sometimes attacks things that it shouldn't be, like peanuts, for example. And I have a master's in the immunology of infectious diseases. And so cut to 2020, when the pandemic really kind of took off, there was just a lot of confusion from family and friends. And given that I've been doing this for a little while, I was trying to keep up with the literature and the scientific research as it was coming out, and then dilute that, form an opinion, and speak to family and friends about it. And so at this point, it's been over 2 years, and I went through all of the data, most of it myself, to really try to understand why it is that these vaccines were the best option for my community and for myself as well before we reached that decision.
Mm-hmm. And tell us where you're originally from, Azza, with that beautiful accent.
From London, so born and raised in London.
Born and raised in London.
Yeah.
And so do you come to the States, to the university? Is that how you get to
Correct.
America?
So I did my PhD in London, and then after graduating, I moved over to Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School to work on food allergies and do my postdoc. And so I'm not a physician, so I'm not an MD. I don't see patients. What I do is mainly lab work. Was what I'm trained in is collecting cells from humans or doing animal work to really understand how our different immune cells interact with each other, and how the immune system itself comes together in certain ways to protect us from disease. And so lots of looking down a microscope.
Absolutely. And so it is complex, to say the very least. And so many people have said, well, with this vaccination or with these vaccinations, it was done so quickly. And when we look at other diseases like cancer and lupus that you mentioned earlier, and there's been no cure or no vaccination for many of the ailments that we know in today's culture. How is it that they were able to get this vaccine produced and on the market and FDA approved so quickly?
Yep. So the main thing to remember here is that vaccines aren't like drugs or treatments, right? So for example, if you have diabetes, you take insulin in order to fool the body in a way into thinking it's making its own so that you can modulate yourself. And so when it comes to drugs and treatments, it is true that getting approval for them takes a really long time, because you have to look at things like, usually with drugs and treatments, you take them daily. And so you have to look at what happens over time when there's a buildup in the system. You have to monitor long term. But when it comes to vaccines are actually different. So I'm going to take a step back here and just explain something very quickly,
okay.
which is that when it comes to infection, right, from the minute that you're born, things fly in through your nose and your eyes and other openings in your body all of the time. And your immune system is tasked with saying, this thing is good, it can stay, this thing is bad, I'm going to attack it, right? So when it comes to infectious organisms, things like SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-1, we could also talk about other viruses like HIV, we can talk about bacterial infections. With things like this, right? There is nothing better than your own immune system, like training your own immune system into fighting these things. And what typically happens is that when you get infected with these things, what you want is the immune system to remember that it's there so that you make memory responses, immune memory that stays in your system. And if you're ever re-exposed, these things are already in your system and they're ready to go. And that is the premise of what vaccines are. They're one element of the thing itself so that you can make those immune memory responses, have them in your system. And when you're exposed to the real thing, you're ready to go. And so to really make sure that this point is clear, let's go back to January 2020, right? Okay. SARS-CoV-2 was discovered in December of 2019 in China. In around January, February, scientists looked at the blood of people who were getting the virus and recovering well from it. And what they were finding is even though the virus itself has over 28 proteins in it, right? It has all of these proteins that make it what it is. The people that were recovering and doing well all had B cells and T cells, so immune memory cells that remembered, that were reactive to just the spike protein of the virus. So immediately scientists thought, well, if this is the only part that the immune system remembers anyway, instead of having all of the other stuff as well in this vaccine, the spike protein became the candidate for all of the vaccines that we currently have authorized in the US. So what that means is that when you go to get vaccinated, you get the spike protein, your immune system looks at it and it makes B cells and T cells that are specific to that spike protein. So spike specific T cells, spike specific B cells, they stay in your system. And if you're ever exposed to the virus, which has spike all over its surface, you have those cells in your system ready to go. And so there's no such thing as unnatural immunity. All immunity is natural, but the vaccine basically capitalizes on something that your immune system does anyway, but without showing it all of the other parts that can drive disease.
So let me see if I understand. So I got vaccinated. I got both shots and I got boosted. But when I got the first shot, I got the vaccine that had the spike protein in it. And so if my body was exposed to the virus, that protein would tell the body to fight that off?
So what it is that you got vaccinated, right? When you got vaccinated, your immune system looked at the vaccine, at what was presented to it, and then it made these immune cells that were specific to what it was seeing. And then the vaccine doesn't stay in your system for very long, right? Vaccines in general, we know that with mRNA, the persistence is about 24 hours. The spike protein itself is a few days. Depending on the vaccine, they can stay in your system for a couple of weeks, but then they go away. And what you're left with are those spike-specific B cells and those spike-specific T cells. If you're ever exposed to the virus, walking out and about, and you've been vaccinated, you've gotten a head start. So when that virus gets breathed in, you already have an army of spike-specific cells waiting for that virus, and then it starts to mount the attack. Now, it is possible for people who are vaccinated to get infected, and that is because it's a ratio game here, right? Like if you are in a situation where you get a lot of virus blasted at you, yes, you'll have an army that will kick in and prevent you from the worst outcomes, which is hospitalization and death. But you might still get sick while your immune system is kind of, going back and forth, tug and forth with the virus. Whereas somebody unvaccinated, when that virus is first breathed in, the immune system isn't ready. It's the first time it's encountering that virus. And so the way to think about it is it better for me to go into this war with the virus unprepared, or is it better for me to walk into it prepared?
Wow. Let's do this. Let's take a break here. But when we come back, I want to talk about all of the conspiracy theories that people have, and how can you help to dispel what happened so many years ago with the Tuskegee Airmen and communities of color who believed that something would be good for them, but it was actually harmful. We're going to talk about that plus a lot more right after this. Stay on point. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Our guest this morning is Dr. Azza Gadir. She is an immunologist, well-trained with many years, lots of experience of research and helping us understand the vaccination and hopefully answering some questions that people have and maybe helping people move away from their hesitancies. Now, the vaccination has become so political, Azza, that, one group feels like there's some sort of conspiracy, the other group feels this way. And there are some people that are just saying, I don't care what they say, I don't trust the government, I'm just not going to get vaccinated. Because a lot of people have felt like they put something in it, it's the government's way of controlling them, or down the road, there are going to be some adverse effects, as I alluded to in the last segment with the Tuskegee Airmen and what happened in those instances. How do you speak to that?
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of reason why people would be hesitant. To be honest, I honestly don't know how I would have navigated the last couple of years if I didn't have the background to have like a real-time BS meter a little bit and be able to tell the difference between something that's feasible and something isn't. But I think the best thing is to remember that there's a lot of nuance here, right? Like, for example, with the Tuskegee experiment, it's not that they were treated with something that caused harm. They weren't treated, which was the unethical thing that happened, right? They were given a disease and then they were never treated for it. And so here it's kind of the opposite, where there is a treatment that's offered. But just a few things here, given that the vaccines themselves mimic the infection, right? They're one protein versus the over 28 that you get if you catch the virus itself. And that is the comparison. It's when people say, for example, well, how do we know that there aren't any long-term effects, right? So the way to answer that is to remember that the immune system responds to infection in a specific way. You have two parts to your immune system. You have the immediate part. So when you breathe that thing in, the cells that immediately are like, this thing shouldn't be here, and punch, 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 let's get it out. But and that's actually a very effective way for most of us not to get sick. That process happens millions of times in our lifetime, and we don't even notice most of the time when it's happening. But when it happens, when we get infected with viruses or bacteria, for example, that are like a little bit of more of a challenge, that first stage of your immune system will punch for about 2 to 3 days. When it realizes, I've got a real contender on my hands here, I can't get it out, what it will do is that it will grab a chunk of the offender and it will run to your B and T cells, who are kind of the bad boys of the immune system. And it'll say, this thing is in the body, start training. And then your B and T cells make more of themselves specific to what's been shown to them. And after a few days, they rush out and your B cells make antibodies and your T cells take out any cell that's infected. And the reason why I wanted to explain that process is to say that when it comes to vaccines, there's a lot of understanding that we have from past infections, but also from COVID-19 itself, right? So we know, for example, that COVID-19 does have long-term effects, whereas with the vaccine, we know that if you're going to have an allergic effect, that's going to be that first layer of the immune system. It's going to be within the first 3 days. And if you're going to develop any of the rare effects or adverse events that are associated with exposure to viruses, that starts around day 5 and peaks at week 3. So meaning that in history, we have never had an adverse event after a shot present more than 6 weeks after that shot, right? So even with things like Guillain-Barré or ITP that can happen, rare, but can happen with some vaccines because of what's being shown to your immune system.
And what are those things that you just said? What are those things?
So those are, so their condition. So Guillain-Barré, for example, is an autoimmune condition where when your immune system sees that viral protein, it can actually like trigger, if you have the right genetic background, it can trigger a response and you can develop this condition. But the main thing to remember here is that when you look at people who got COVID-19 versus those that just got the spike protein from the vaccine, the rates of Guillain-Barré, the rates of idiopathic thrombocytopenia, these things are higher in the COVID-19 group. So the general thinking is that it's the viral protein that's driving it. And with the COVID-19 cohort, they're also getting these conditions, but at a way higher rate. And that's why doctors will say, just go get the vaccine, because what you're comparing here is one protein versus the over 28 that you would get with the virus.
So what do you say to people that say, okay, I'm not going to get the vaccine because every time I ever got the flu shot, I ended up getting the flu. And those people will say, I'm not going to get the vaccination because I don't want to get the virus.
Yep. So I would say that none of the COVID-19 vaccines have the virus itself in it, the replicating virus that can infect your cells. The vaccines just have the spike protein in it. So it's not possible to get the disease itself or to develop the disease from the vaccine. When it comes to the flu shot, I would say that this is the thing about anecdotes that can be difficult, because my anecdotal experience could be very different from yours. Right. And the only way to really know the difference is to look at a lot of data and look at whose anecdote is more accurate or more representative, right? So that's why generally it's better to look at studies that have larger data points to look at what's happening. And so this is the thing with people who experience things firsthand. But I will say in answer to your earlier point about the fact that people not trusting governments, that's something that I completely understand. But I do want to remind here that this is a pandemic. It's worldwide. So it's not just the US that's impacted.
Right.
Multiple countries are impacted. Data is not just being generated by one person or these pharma companies. It's being generated by public institutions, hospitals, universities, also private institutions, companies who obviously are incentivized by different things. There are too many people with a seat at this table. You've even got governments that hate each other that got completely thwacked by COVID-19. And yes, they developed their own vaccines, but we know that all of these vaccines are ultimately doing the same thing, which is training the immune system to be ready for the actual thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's in response to that, I would just say that it would, given that I've looked through a lot of the data, and I would say that to have a conspiracy coordinated at that scale is just not something to me that I view as feasible. Now, I don't think that the trials or the data are perfect. There's always stuff that can be discussed, but I just think in terms of zooming out and saying the vaccine, is it good or is it bad? If you just look at the numbers and you look at the fact that it's 2 years on now, the first people who got vaccinated in the trials were in March 2020. Mm-hmm. They are still being monitored. So they're still taking blood from these people, looking at what's going on. We have billions of people vaccinated worldwide. And we're also seeing similar immune dynamics depending on the vaccine itself, whether it's the Russian Sputnik one or it's the, Pfizer or Moderna. So, for me, I just think in terms of feasibility, it's not feasible for me to have a conspiracy theory at this scale, where you have all of these people, epidemiologists, virologists, immunologists, people who have very different interests, mm-hmm. all kind of agreeing on similar things. But there, of course, are going to be some things that people will butt heads about. But that's not the question of whether the vaccine is good or bad anymore.
Absolutely. Let's take a break here, Azza. But when we come back, I want to talk about us winding down with Omicron. And I also want to talk about why we're seeing some people with what they're calling long COVID and lots of after effects after they have had COVID and come out of it. Stay on point for this very interesting and informative conversation. We're back right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Our guest this morning is Dr. Azza Gadir. She's an immunologist with well over a decade of experience. She has read the science, understands the science. And for those people that are saying, I need more information, I need to do more research. Azza, when people say that to me, it makes my brain go tilt, 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 because this conversation is really, quite frankly, it is a lot to absorb and to process. So for those people that are sort of getting comfortable because Omicron was not nearly as devastating as Delta and the other variants, and it just came to most people like a bad sinus infection or deep congestion, not nearly as bad. Do we understand these variants and why we're getting such differences in the way that they behave?
Yeah, a little. The data is still trickling out, but to take a step back, when it comes to the variants, right? the main thing to remember is that viruses mutate by nature of what they are, right? So they will hijack your cell, hijack all the machinery to make more of themselves. The cell bursts, and then that virus goes on to infect other cells. And so most of the mutations that viruses, every time they divide, they mutate. And actually, most mutations aren't really meaningful in terms of how that virus behaves. But the problem is because this pandemic is continuing to rage out of control in so many countries, the more time you buy these viruses in cells, the more likely you are to see mutations that actually will have real world impact. And that's what we're seeing, is that it was always expected that if this pandemic did rage, that we would get new variants from different pockets of the world emerging every couple of months. Omicron was the most recent. I do think that there was a slight miscommunication in saying that Omicron was milder, because I think there were a lot of things that came into viewing it that way, because vaccine rates were high in lots of parts of the country. And of course, like with vaccine rates, given that someone vaccinated gets a head start, when you have someone vaccinated and unvaccinated, you need more to get that vaccinated person sick than somebody who is unvaccinated, okay. Right? It gives you it gives you a head start. And so when it comes to Omicron, I think for a lot of people, mild just meant, so clinical mildness meant that they didn't end up in a hospital bed and they didn't end up in a ventilator, but it really took a lot of people out for like a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. It was like very intense for some people. I will say that for me, from the very kind of early days of this pandemic, I wasn't afraid. We could say, the slightly ableist tropes of like, I'm young, I'm healthy. Right. I wasn't afraid of like dying of COVID if I got it. But one thing that I was concerned about was long COVID, which is the fact that there is a percentage of people who, even after they've cleared the virus, maintain symptoms for over a year after they've cleared that virus. So things like tinnitus, things like clotting, things like chronic fatigue, a lot of neurological things like depression, not being able to sleep, etc. And the problem here is that with Omicron, we're still waiting for the data to come out as to really understand how it impacts long COVID compared to the earlier variants. But long COVID is something that has been seen with Omicron as well, as that there are people that are struggling to really beat this. And so I would say that so again, for me, I was afraid of long COVID. I didn't want a chronic disorder on my hands. And that's why I didn't want to get the virus, even though I wasn't afraid of getting sick. So that's why I would say, yes, it's better to get vaccinated and get a head start, even if you don't think that Omicron was too bad, because you're still taking a risk in terms of exposing yourself to all of those proteins, but also that when it comes to the virus itself, I can't control how I'm exposed, right? You might be exposed in a supermarket fleetingly and get a really low amount of virus. I might be exposed at home at a dinner and I get a lot of virus, right? And that variability is why some people develop memory, some people don't develop memory, some people get really sick, some people don't. And so I would say that while the pandemic is continuing to rage, we do have some data that Omicron was milder than Delta, and that it might have impacted other parts of the body. So for example, Delta was known to infect the airways in a very specific way. And with Omicron, it seemed that it was more sinus impact. Mm-hmm. And that might make a difference, but we're still really waiting for data to solidify that. We need time to pass to really know. But I would say that for me, it doesn't end with Omicron. The pandemic is still continuing to rage, and fingers crossed, God willing, yes, the variants will all, there is a chance that we won't get variants that are more severe than in the past. But at this point, seeing as we are seeing emergence of variants, some bad, some not so bad, that will likely continue to happen for the next few months or year until we can really get a hold of this pandemic a bit more.
So as a scientist, Azza, did you know early on that there would be such a thing as long COVID? Because we're just now really hearing about long COVID. It wasn't something that was talked about initially because we were trying to save people's lives. We were trying to, almost 1 million people died in a very short period of time. Did scientists, were they aware that there would be lingering, sometimes catastrophic effects?
Yep. So there was some data that was starting to spill out a few months after the start of the pandemic where, a lot of doctors and physicians were saying some of these patients are reporting long-term symptoms and their symptoms aren't going away. I will say that long COVID itself has gone through a little bit of it's evolved a little bit, because with long COVID, originally it was just an umbrella term for anybody who had symptoms long term. And that's why the data was a little all over the place, because depending on the country, people were defining it differently. But now it's become clear that there's like a set of symptoms that physicians know to look for. The other thing that I want to add here is that we have immune cell data. So there are labs that are taking blood from patients that have long COVID or suspected long COVID and looking at what's going on in their blood system. And you can see clearly in a percentage of these people that they've developed kind of an autoimmune phenotype. So they're developing autoantibodies. So there's the theory here is that for some people with long COVID, the viral infection itself is triggering something. So when you get the virus, your immune system tries to fight it. It can be quite arduous. It could be back and forth. And then by the time you clear that virus, the immune system kind of starts to misfire and starts to target things that it shouldn't be targeting. And that can have a range of reasons, genetic, environmental, etc. But at this point, I mean, we are still waiting for time to happen, but there are labs that are collecting data from people over time to really look at what's happening and to see how to treat these people. But yeah, I would say right at the beginning, of course, we didn't know about it. But when we started to realize that with COVID, it was different to other viruses, was not just because it was super infectious, because it was, not because ICU capacity was going up through the roof. But when the long COVID kind of data started to come out, it became clear that this is what was differentiating it, that there's a substantial number of people that are not able to fight this, like will fight the virus and then will maintain symptoms long term. And that impacts quality of life. I mean, some of these people aren't able to go back to work. Some of these people are now on disability, and it's a big life change. And I think the most troubling thing about long COVID is that it doesn't seem to be predictable in terms of it's not the elderly and the vulnerable that are developing it. In fact, there are cases, lots and lots of cases of people who had asymptomatic disease, didn't have any symptoms, but were COVID positive, and then started to see symptoms appear in the weeks after they tested positive. And so given that young and healthy people as well can get long COVID, this is something that I think that we should all kind of keep in mind.
Wow. Azza, it just seems like you love it. You just seem like you love talking about it. You have such agency on talking about it, and it just does my heart good to hear somebody be able to break it down, hopefully in bite-sized pieces. I want to keep you for just one more segment, if that's okay, because I want to talk about children. Now the vaccine has been created for our 5-year-olds and up. What should parents need to understand about whether to vaccinate their kids or whether not to vaccinate? Stay on point. We're back right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Not only is Azza Gadir beautiful, she is smart, and she is making science palatable. She's making it digestible so that we can take in enough information to hopefully make a better decision for ourselves, our families, and even our communities. And before we went to break, Azza, we were talking about, how this long COVID is affecting people. And the scariest part about that is that I don't know where the treatment will come from to make people whole again. What are science and scientists saying about that piece?
Yeah. So I think that, I'm hopeful because, my background was in autoimmune diseases, right, which are chronic and unpredictable. And, there's a lot of overlap with long COVID. And so I do have hope that there will be a lot of funding that will be put into answering, for people who have these unpredictable diseases like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, things like this, MS. And also long COVID, I think we're going to start to really understand some of the mechanisms and start to make better treatments for people that have these conditions. But I would say that in general, prevention is always better than cure. And this is where vaccines are actually excellent because they're the ultimate prevention, right? You're giving yourself a head start, and then you're stopping yourself from being at the stage of having to get lots of treatments, take things daily, things that are likely experimental over a long period of time. But I am hopeful, and I think there are some really excellent and brilliant immunologists that are really focusing on this question of trying to understand what the best treatment options might be for people who do have long COVID.
Mm-hmm. Now, our babies, they're currently working on the 4 and under but approval for 5 and up. Why should parents vaccinate their 5-year-olds?
Yep. So a couple of things here. So children have excellent innate immune responses, meaning that when they're born, that initial stage of the immune system where when they see something, the immune system attacks, that's good, right? They have a really, really good innate immune system. But when it comes to that second stage, that trained immunity, so the B and T cells, they're essentially born with like a blank dictionary. And as they experience things and infectious things, they fill those pages with memory responses. So B and T cells to this virus, B and T cells to this bacteria, and they fill those pages. The main thing here is that adults actually, with age, your T cells get a little leakier, which is why as you get older or in people that are elderly, they can have ropey responses to infectious disease. Whereas with children, they have great responses. But we still have to vaccinate them at a young age, right? They have vaccine schedules because, if you look at 100 years ago, children were dying at a very young age from things like polio, for example. Whereas now we have a vaccine that basically trains your immune system, gives it a head start and can prevent the disease in children. And so in answer to the question of, as a parent, I understand that there might be health anxiety about this decision, but ultimately for me, it will always be a better option, even for a young child, to have that head start and to build those immune responses rather than taking their chances with that virus itself, given that the rates are up. I know that the data shows that generally children do fare well or fare better when they do get SARS-CoV-2, but there is still a small percent of children that can develop something called multi-inflammatory syndrome in children. There are some children that do develop long COVID. And so if you have a vaccine, that's why most of my nieces and nephews and cousins are vaccinated that are really young, because if there is a vaccine, it's better to give them that head start and then to take the chance with the virus. And the last thing that I want to say here, which is just kind of interesting for parents, is that you hear the tropes where people say, let your kids play in the dirt, let them, don't keep them at home. And the reason why they say that is because we do have data that shows exposure. If you expose children to infectious organisms and to things early in life, that it actually can protect them from or develop their immune system in a really robust way that lasts all the way into adulthood. And so that's why in general, I would say that that's one thing to remember when it comes to, worrying about, I don't want to overwhelm my child's immune system. Your child's immune system is not going to get overwhelmed. Like the immune system is it's intricate, it's synchronized, it knows what it's doing. In a lot of cases, children can get more than one vaccine at the same time and the immune system is not getting confused. It knows what it's doing. It's mounting separate responses. And so I would say that there is a lot of certainty in this, and we do understand a lot about how children respond to infectious disease. Saying that, with these vaccines, we do have to start with older people and move backwards before we get to children, just because we protect children as a society. And that's the way that we've always developed drugs and vaccines and treatment. Well, not always, but sure. That's why we have the FDA in place and certain regulatory measures in place to protect them.
And so for those people that are just not going to get vaccinated because of whatever the reason, and they end up getting the virus, they get COVID, and there's something called now the monoclonal antibody. And a lot of people who just didn't get vaccinated do want to get the monoclonal antibodies to get well. Help us to understand how you could want to get that, but you don't get vaccinated, and what are the differences?
So I'm not sure I completely understand that either. I mean, for me, the part that I don't understand is that monoclonals are experimental, right? We know that some of them are very, very efficient, but I don't prevention for me is always the best thing that you can do instead of waiting till you get something and then taking a chance with something that may not work for you or it may not be effective. And so I would say that that's the part that I don't understand, because I think at this point, the vaccines, again, like the ones authorized in the US, are being used by multiple different countries, right? And they're all reporting very similar data, private institutions, public institutions. And so that for me, I can't really understand, but I do think that there are a lot of reasons why people might not want to get vaccinated. And I would say for anyone who's unvaccinated, the data does show at this point that being vaccinated, even if you've had COVID-19 before. So people who are unvaccinated can get repeat infections, right? Mm-hmm. They can get Delta, they can then get Omicron, and depending on the variant, they can continue to get infected. And a big part of that is the variability we were talking about, that some people will get a heavy viral punch, someone might not. Mm-hmm. You know, your immune system, if it's a little ropey, you might not respond the same way as someone else. There's just too much variability. Whereas with the vaccines, we know it's the spike, the bit that the immune system remembers anyway. It's at a dose that has been modulated in the clinical trials, again, by multiple countries, right? Modulated in the clinical trials. We know that this mounts immune memory responses in people. It's 1 or 2 shots. So you get 1 shot and then you get another one a few weeks later. We can also talk about the boosters in a minute, but in general, it's 1 or 2 shots. And it basically just gives you a head start and makes sure that you're as protected as possible. And at this point, we do know that people who have had COVID-19 before and then went on to get the vaccine, or the other way around, have the best type of immune response. It's called hybrid immunity. And in this group, there is the lowest risk of reinfection from future variants, and also the lowest risk of developing symptomatic disease and also severe disease and death.
Mm-hmm. And quickly, why is it important to get boosted?
So I actually really love this question. It's a very cool thing that the immune system does. So the reason why we have, so when you get those 2 vaccine shots, you have a primer and then you have a booster, right? The first time your immune system sees that spike protein, assuming you've never had COVID before, you get the first injection. The immune system is like, what is this thing? It goes and it makes your spike-specific T cells and your B cells, and they're pummeling through your circulation. And the immune system is aware that this thing is out there and it's a threat because it just saw it. And so you're making those responses and they're pummeling through your system. When you get that second injection after about 3 or 4 weeks, the immune system just really locks in. So what it does is that it kind of does this thing where it's like, why is this thing back again? Mm-hmm. And what it does, it goes into the pool of B cells and the pool of T cells that it's made. It selects the best warriors, the ones that make the best amount of antibody when it comes to B cells, the ones that have T cells that bind the hardest, because there'll be different types of binding. It'll pick those best warriors out and it will use them as a frame of reference for making cells in the future. So that's why every time your immune system sees the spike protein or sees something, it gets better at recognizing it. And the way to think about it is, if you didn't know someone very well and they changed their haircut, you might not recognize them. But if you know them really well, they can wear glasses, they can change their haircut, their clothes, you're going to know it's them. So it's kind of, that's an analogy for how the immune system gets better. Now, what happens, and this is typical with most infectious diseases, is when you hit a few months after that exposure, so after your second vaccine, the immune system will say to itself, okay, coast is clear. I haven't seen this thing in a while. Mm-hmm. And what happens is that your B cells that make antibodies stop, and your T cells will, calm down, making lots of themselves. And these things go and tuck away in your system. If you're ever re-exposed again, they will jump out and start making more of themselves to fight the thing. But the problem is that when you're in the middle of a pandemic that is still raging, that lag of reactivation could mean getting quite sick for a couple of days, having to isolate, And so what a booster does at that point, when you get the same thing that was in the first 2 shots again, is that it basically reminds the immune system that threat is still out there, keep making the stuff. And so it jumps out and it keeps making the stuff. And I'd love to just mention that the reason the immune system does that is very, very cool. So one reason that it does that is because if we walked around carrying every single antibody that we had ever made in our lives, we would look like chipmunks, because our lymph nodes would constantly be inflamed, but also our blood would be really gloopy because the protein burden would be really high. So it's basically a way for the immune system to create a library and just call things as it needs it, from like a memory library where it just pulls what it needs. But essentially that's what a booster is. I mean, a booster is just reminding the immune system that threat is still out there, keep making the stuff pummeling through. And for me personally, I want to go back to normal. I want to start seeing people. And yes, the pandemic is raging. And so I'll take a booster every 5 or 6 months just to kind of keep things topped up and stop myself from having to be sick every few months.
Amazing. The human body is absolutely amazing. And Azza, you have broken it down in a masterful way. Thank you so much for your commitment to science.
Thank you for having me.
Indeed. Hey, everybody, stay on point. We're back after this.